From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. The big news overnight didn't come out of Washington. It came out of Wilmington, Delaware, where presumptive presidential candidate Joe Biden announced that Senator Kamala Harris would be his running mate. Welcome now somebody who's a fellow member of the California delegation. He's Congressman Ted Liu, Democrat representing the 33rd Congressional District. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. Let me ask the most basic question. If this is the right answer, why is it the right answer?
Thank you, David, for your question. America should be thrilled that Joe Biden selected Kamala Harris as a vice presidential candidate. I've known Kamala for many years. I was her first congressional endorser for president. She is a former prosecutor. She ran the largest legal operation in the world as Attorney General of California. And as U.S. Senator, she has introduced groundbreaking legislation. She's a perfect candidate to be vice president.
So let's pick up on that prosecutor, because you've been something of a prosecutor yourself, working your way up to colonel, actually, as I understand, in the Air Force. You actually ran against Kamala Harris, as I understand it, for state attorney general. There's been some criticism from the left, I would have to say, if I can characterize it that way, that she was too harsh as a prosecutor. Is that possibly a problem for her with the left wing of the Democratic Party?
I don't think so. And by the way, my advice is never run against Kamala Harris. So in terms of her record, you don't get to be elected as the district attorney of San Francisco and then elected statewide in California as attorney general if you weren't progressive. She has a record that she can put up against anyone, and she's going to prosecute Donald Trump in terms of showing all his failures in addressing this pandemic, in terms of creating jobs, in terms of his multiple failures on the foreign policy front. And she's done that with other witnesses before her in congressional hearings. She'll continue to do that as vice president.
Does she help the ticket in this respect, that President Trump clearly wants to make law and order, as he calls it, a major issue? Talked about it again yesterday at the White House. Does she actually, as we would say, pull teeth on that argument a little bit?
As a former prosecutor, as a former attorney general, she completely understands the risks that law enforcement personnel take when they put on their uniform every day. She also understands institutional racism has affected many institutions across America. And with the George Floyd murder, she was one of the first people to step out and participate in the rallies and marches and introduce legislation to crack down on institutional racism.
Congressman, one of the things that strikes me is that in some ways this is a really surprising, historic choice. First African-American woman to run for this office, first Asian-American woman to run for this office, and yet it seemed almost obvious by the time it came. What does that tell us about where we are right now in the country? Does it say that we've made some progress?
Progress will not be stopped, and I think it shows a lot that Joe Biden selected such a historic pick in Kamala Harris. And it's not just who she is, it's also what she's done. When I was in the California State Assembly, I was chair of banking, and then I worked on these issues in the California State Senate. And I know that Kamala Harris, at the same time, worked with us, and she fought the big banks in terms of the settlement and extracted a fair and better settlement for consumers. She has the courage and tenacity to not only be vice president, but also to really do what is needed in America to right our country.
Should Wall Street be concerned about her?
Not at all, because the settlement that she had with the Wall Street banks was a fair settlement. And at the end of the day, everyone shook hands and consumers got their things that they should have gotten because of the failures of some of the banks during the Great Recession.
One of the issues that President Trump has raised, trying to tar both Vice President Biden and Kamala Harris, is that they're left. They're socialist, or at least they're inclined towards socialism. She has taken some positions on universal health care in the past that could trouble some voters, including at one point saying she wanted to eliminate private insurance, although I believe she backed off of that. What about her position? Is she a centrist? Is she left of center? Is she far left?
I believe it depends on the issue. She, like many Americans, supports universal health care. That's an issue that Democrats have run on, will continue to run on. And we see with this COVID-19 pandemic how important getting quality, affordable health care is to everyone. Right now, the Donald Trump administration is suing to eliminate the only law in the nation that guarantees coverage for pre-existing conditions. Kamala Harris will fight back against that, as will Joe Biden. And if you support health care, then you should support Biden-Harris in 2020.
Should we expect more taxes out of Biden-Harris?
The Affordable Care Act has been in place for several years, and that has delivered quality, affordable health care. It protects pre-existing conditions. You did not see a large spike in taxes. In fact, what you saw was a reduction in healthcare premiums, and that is what we're fighting to preserve and protect. And we really wish Donald Trump would stop suing to eliminate the only law in the nation that guarantees pre-existing conditions healthcare coverage.
So I take your point on healthcare, but more broadly, Vice President Biden has proposed a number of programs that would cost a lot of money, and there have been indications he's going to have to tax a fair amount to get that done. In fact, Kamala Harris, as I understand it, supported actually a financial transactions tax. So as a practical matter, I'm not saying it's good or it's bad, but in deciding whether to vote for this ticket, should we expect our taxes will go up, some of us?
It's hard to predict what the House and the Senate and the White House would do. What I do know is the Republican tax law that passed was a very large scam that essentially increased taxes on millions of middle-class families. It also gave most of the benefits to the top 1% in our country. That's just something that Americans did not really expect or want. And I know that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are both opposed to the Republican tax law.
And finally, let's talk about China a little bit. You're a Taiwanese America, and you can understand, and you have strong views, as I understand it, on some of the things that China has been doing. Kamala Harris also does. What is her position on China as you understand it?
So, first of all, what China did in suppressing information about the virus at the beginning is indefensible. That's very different than having the President of the United States use phrases like Kung flu or Chinese virus, because that fuels hatred against Asian Americans. And I know that Kamala Harris, who is half Asian American, has fought and will continue to fight for all minorities and to stand up against hate crimes. We know that across America, there's been over 2,000 hate crimes against Asian Americans, and we need the Biden-Harris duo to really stand up and fight to make sure we don't have any more hate crimes across America targeted at Americans who happen to be minorities.
Okay, thank you so much, Congressman, for your time and your thoughts today. That's Congressman Ted Liu, Democrat of California. Coming up here, the Trump doctrine. Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, is here with his assessment of nearly 4 years now of President Trump's foreign policy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. President Trump called Kamala Harris the, quote, meanest and most horrible senator when asked about her joining the Joe Biden ticket on Tuesday. Yet California campaign finance records show that he gave donations of $5,000 in 2011 and $1,000 in 2013 to Harris's reelection campaign for California Attorney General. The records show Mr. Trump's daughter Ivanka also gave $2,000 to Harris in 2014. In Texas, there are questions about the severity of the coronavirus outbreak. The state's positivity rate surged to a record 23.9%, but a backlog of more than 1 million test results may be skewing the calculations. The statewide figure is at odds with all the other major metrics used to assess the health crisis. Texas has had more than 500,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy will allow the state's public schools the option of all remote teaching when classes resume in September. That's according to CBS News. The decision is a retreat from Governor Murphy's earlier requirement that all districts offer some level of in-person instruction. New Jersey's largest teachers union and a group representing school administrators say classroom instruction isn't safe yet. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Secretary of State Dean Acheson presided over the creation of the international system that came after World War II, including things like the United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank. And his memoir was titled Present at the Creation. But President Trump has taken a very different course. And so the title of Richard Haass' new piece for Foreign Affairs has the title Present at the Disruption. Richard is the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, of course, and he's also the author of the best-selling book, The World, A Brief Introduction. Welcome back, Richard. Great to have you with us. This is a terrific piece I recommend to everyone, sort of a thoroughgoing review of President Trump. But it really does raise the question, are we dismantling what we created after World War II?
Good to be with you, David. The short answer is yes. What's worse, we're dismantling it without replacing it with something better. In some cases, we're not replacing it with anything at all. And the dismantling begins with international institutions. We've pulled out probably from 10 of them by now, different treaties, weakening alliances. So again, we've essentially, the president is trying to undo a lot of his inheritance, and almost like healthcare, repeal without replace.
So the president has said repeatedly on the campaign trail, and then as president, we've been taken advantage of. The United States has been taken advantage of. Other people are benefiting. We're paying all the bills. What has this international system created after World War II actually done for the prosperity of America?
He does think that. When I met with him when he was still a candidate, he believed that fervently, that trade agreements have ripped us off, and that essentially the costs of foreign policy, or stationing of troops overseas and the like, far outweighs any benefits. What he seems to be missing here, David, is that for 75 years, there's not been a great power conflict. To the extent there was a conflict, the Cold War, one, it stayed cold, and two, it ended on terms that were extraordinarily favorable to us. Meanwhile, standards of living in this country have gone up dramatically, one by some measures 90-fold since the end of World War II. The average American lives on the order of 10 years longer than he or she lived 75 years ago. Democracy is far more prevalent around the world. So I'm hard-pressed, as someone who's trained as a historian, to find any other period of history as productive and constructive as the last 75 years. I'm not going to sit here and say we didn't make mistakes. Of course we did in Vietnam, Iraq, and so forth. But by and large, on balance, this has been a remarkable run.
Richard, even when Donald Trump came to office, things were changing. I mean, China was growing very quickly. It was growing to challenge us as the world's dominant economic power. Was it inevitable that we had to do something other than what was left over after World War II?
Oh, absolutely, for several reasons. One, you point to, China has emerged in many ways, and we needed to adjust our policy. And I think the president deserves some credit for calling out China. Where I think he gets the blame is I don't see anything coherent or consistent for dealing with China. Probably an even greater problem with American foreign policy is a lot of the institutions that you referred to are getting long in the tooth. We've got a whole new set of challenges in the world, things like how to regulate cyberspace, what to do about climate change, what to do about proliferation. And we simply don't have the mechanisms in place in the world. There's a real shortfall when it comes to international arrangements. So addressing that has got to be on our agenda. Unfortunately, the president is essentially uninterested or even opposed to international agreements of those sorts.
You mentioned China, obviously a terribly important relationship for the United States, economically as well as geopolitically. Where are we headed right now with China if we keep going the direction we are? The president clearly believes that if he keeps putting enough pressure on China, he will do something good for the United States and good for U.S. workers.
I can see two things happening if we keep going. In the short run, I'm actually quite worried about a military incident, say between American and Chinese aircraft or ships in something like the South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, near islands also claimed by Japan in the Pacific. And the real challenge then will be to try to put a lid on it so an incident doesn't grow into a conflict. In the longer run, David, I'm actually concerned about a U.S.-Chinese Cold War, an across-the-board competition that at times has us lined up against one another. It's dangerous, it's costly, but also it would probably rule out U.S.-Chinese cooperation, say, in dealing with North Korea or dealing with global health or dealing with climate change. And I think we're pretty far down that road.
So one of the focal points of our relationship with China, certainly under President Trump, has been trade. But the trade issues facing the United States are not limited to China. They go much more broadly, including the very institution of the WTO and our relations with Europe, with a lot of our allies. What is happening to our economy because of what has happened with trade under President Trump?
Yeah, we've lost a real chance, I think, to grow global trade and also to improve the way it's regulated. If we had stayed in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that would have teamed us up with countries all together. We would have represented over 40% of the world's GDP. We then could have put tremendous pressure on China to raise its game, to meet our standards. Or we could reform the World Trade Organization. It's clearly flawed, but then the question is, how do you make it better? Instead, what we're essentially doing is undermining it by not approving any judges for the one part of the World Trade Organization that's actually worked quite well and often in our interest, which is its adjudication panel for resolving trade disputes.
As you know so well, Richard, we've got an election in this country coming up November 3rd, and including for the President of the United States. Exactly. There's a rumor to that effect. But as you look at that possible fork in the road, how do you look at a Biden, now we know Harris administration with respect to foreign policy as opposed to Trump-Pence?
Well, I think the differences would be much more willingness to work with allies. I think that would probably be sort of the foundation. They deal with allies and then approach all these regional and global challenges. I think you'd probably see reentry into various international arrangements and institutions. The problem for a Biden-Harris administration, or the challenge, would be their inheritance would be rough. It'd be a really daunting inbox. 4 years ago, David, you'll recall I wrote a book called A World in Disarray. Well, now it's disarray on steroids. So I think they would face that all the time. Think about it. The next president and vice president are going to have to still deal with a pandemic here at home, tens of millions unemployed, a country divided by politics and race, possibly by the election itself. So that they're going to have a situation where there'll be greater demand than ever for American leadership and involvement in the world. At the same time, the home front will be calling out for repair.
So, Richard, you deal with these world leaders on a regular basis. Is there a pent-up demand for an alternative to President Trump? I'm reminded of the fact that at the end of George W. Bush's administration, it was thought that our reputation, some people thought, was not very good in the world. And then President Obama came in. Certainly the Obama administration, I think they turned it around pretty quickly. Is that realistic?
Well, I think the greatest demand for change and something like a return to what people thought they knew, for the familiar, is with our allies. They treasure American reliability and predictability. Consultations are important. So in Europe and Asia is where you find the greatest demand for something familiar. But I would think in countries like Turkey or Russia, they're pretty happy with what they've got. Countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia were very uncomfortable with the Obama administration. China can't quite make up its mind. On one hand, the United States has created geopolitical vacuums that China's happy to fill. On the other hand, they find it really hard to figure out an America that's so wildly inconsistent.
Richard, you talked about what it might look under a President Obama if he were to be elected. A President Biden if he were to be reelected. But what would the alternative be? Let's assume we have a second term of President Trump. What does that world look like? And particularly coming back to American prosperity, what might it mean for American prosperity?
David, in my experience, reelected presidents essentially double down. They continue. They feel they've got a mandate for more of the same, or in some cases, just more. So I would think a second term would be very familiar. Alliances would wither. The United States would essentially become unilateral, very aggressively protectionist and bilateral on trade. I think it would be very familiar. But I also think my follow-on article would not be present at the disruption. It would be present at the destruction. And I think in 4 more years, you would not have the architecture or the machinery that has served us well over 75 years. If President Trump were watching this, he would say, that's great. The problem is, again, I've yet to hear him or anyone who works for him articulate an alternative that looks viable and preferable. So my real concern is in 4 years, we could face a very rough international environment, really turbulent. And for American business, for American investors, they would have to factor in what would be a much rougher, much less predictable or stable world they'd be operating in.
And what does that do for national security? You wrote another book saying national security essentially begins at home. It's on our economic strength.
Well, it's bad by any measure. National security, foreign policy begins at home. It doesn't end there. Look, we're suffering now from a pandemic that began in Wuhan, China. On 9/11, it was people who were trained in Afghanistan. Climate change comes from everywhere. So the real lesson of the modern era is that nothing is local or stays local for long. So if we have a foreign policy that essentially gives short shrift to the world, we're going to pay an enormous price for it at home. We as a country, we as a society and economy cannot thrive in a world that begins to unravel.
Okay, Richard, really great to have you with us. Thank you so much. That's Richard Haass. He's president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm delighted to say he's going to be remaining with us for the second hour of Balance of Power. We have a lot more to discuss over on Bloomberg Radio. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now to check in on the markets. Abigail Doolittle is here. So Abigail, looks pretty good.
Risk-on mode indeed, David. We certainly have the bulls back out after a bit of a pause yesterday, and stocks are sharply higher at this point. In fact, that New York FANG index on pace for its best day in about 2 weeks. And I bring that up because that is what's really leading. Of course, over the last week or so, there's been more of a cyclical tilt to stock gains, meaning the financials and industrials are in charge. But today, that's not the case. The Dow is lagging a bit, up just 0.9%, if you can call that just. The S&P 500 at this point up a very healthy 1.5%, but that NASDAQ 100 really leading the way, up 2.7%, being helped out by, no surprise, tech. That's the best sector on the day, while the worst sectors, financials, energy, and industrials. And again, that New York FANG index really charging higher, up 3.5%. So this is going to lead to some questions on the part of some folks on Wall Street. Will we see this year's quote-unquote defense, that tech trade, take over again? Or will the cyclical rally continue? It seems to be back and forth over the last couple of months, David.
A big question on Wall Street. The question is what's going on in Washington? Because, it sort of surprises me at this point. We thought we were going to have a stimulus package last week, the week before. Now they're talking about going well into September, maybe up to the deadline of shutting down the government October 1. What is the market pricing in? Because I thought the market was based on there would be a stimulus.
That would be my assessment of the situation as well, David, and especially considering that you have the S&P 500 less than 1% away from its all-time high. The NASDAQ 100 recently had made all-time highs, suggests that investors and traders really have thought that stimulus is priced in, at least $1.5 trillion, perhaps more. But the fact that we do have the possibility of a delay, we do have a delay right now for about 2 weeks, and that means that not only will some Americans be in a world of hurt, but the economy in August, and if it does extend, the impasse all the way to September really could create an issue all the way into September. In fact, Mark Zandi saying that even if a deal was reached now and implemented quickly, we could see another recession. So stocks really not pricing that in right now. Maybe a case of too far, too fast, David.
Yeah, everyone has to be concerned. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. We're going to continue this conversation because we do hear that Congress may not come up with that stimulus package until September or even October. Libby Cantrill of PIMCO will be joining us to give us her sense of what that means for the economy and for Washington. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Last week, we were told that a stimulus package out of Congress was imminent, any day, any minute. But now it doesn't appear that we're going to get anything even maybe this week, maybe even in September. To take us through all this is Libby Cantrill. She's head of public policy at PIMCO. So, Libby, what is going on? Because we thought we were going to have it for sure. I don't even think they're talking right now, are they?
Yeah, well, good afternoon, David. They're not necessarily talking, and I agree that there was some optimism last week that maybe some of this was just posturing and we would get a deal by this week. Obviously, that does not look likely at this point. However, the sort of framework for a deal is there. There is more agreement than disagreement on some of the big items. But the big sticking point, as you know, is the state and local funding. And Democrats are insisting on funding at $1 trillion. Republicans, of course, in their bill didn't put any money for state and local funding. So that is sort of the big area where they're far apart. However, as we're going into the election, Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, has many folks on his conference who are quite vulnerable and who are likely going to be agitating for some of that state and local funding. So I think the bottom line here is that even though there's quite a lot of brinksmanship and posturing, there will likely get something done just because the political downside risk is just honestly too great of not doing anything.
Libby, is your best guess that President Trump's 4 executive orders over the weekend made things harder or easier to get a deal done? Because it feels like sort of everybody sort of put their pencils back down and forgot about this since he did those executive orders.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I do think that those were in some ways more symbolic than substantive. I think he was trying to rebalance the negotiations, trying to increase leverage for Republicans, and maybe he did that for a day or two, but I think the broader recognition is that those executive orders are limited in terms of what they can actually do for the economy. The unemployment insurance benefit in particular looks like it's going to be very hard for states to implement, and it would only last for a few weeks anyway. So I think that there is a broader recognition that these EOs didn't do very much. And, at the end of the day, Congress has to act. And you saw Majority Leader McConnell come out last night and basically saying that negotiators needed to restart talks. So maybe the EOs put a kind of a pause on those negotiations for a day or two. But I wouldn't be surprised if congressional negotiators didn't start talking again in the next few days or so.
Well, we'll keep waiting on that. In the meantime, the big news overnight, of course, was the designation of Kamala Harris, the senator from California, to be the running mate for Joe Biden. Now, that's not going to have any immediate effect, but as you look at it, what possible effect could it have, first of all, on Joe Biden getting elected, maybe the Senate switching, and then ultimately on policy?
Yeah, I think that his choice of Senator Harris probably helps his electability at the margin. She polls well with women of color, with suburban women, with independents. So, his choice of her probably helps him and his candidacy at the margin. Although, what we've seen from political science perspective, the choice of running mate just doesn't make that much of a difference. We all like to talk about it in Washington, but at the end of the day, it's not really that important because, of course, voters choose the person at the top of the ticket, not necessarily their running mate. So in that way, sort of the approach of do no harm, I think he succeeded. In terms of a policy perspective, of course, she has one of the more liberal voting records actually in the Senate. She's been in the Senate for 4 years now. But she also gets some grief from the progressive left from her prosecutorial history. So, from a policy perspective, it's not clear whether, again, it will make that much of a difference. Usually the running mate goes along with the person on the top of the ticket, so she will probably fall in line from a policy perspective. But her relationships with Capitol Hill will likely help Biden, who obviously has deep connections to the Hill as well. But I think this was kind of a do no harm choice. In some ways, it was the predictable choice, even though it is quite historic in lots of different dimensions.
Okay, thank you so very much, Libby. Always a pleasure to have you with us. That's Libby Cantrill. She's head of public policy at PIMCO. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
And David, thank you. As you and Libby were just alluding to, Joe Biden makes his first appearance with his newly chosen running mate, Senator Kamala Harris, today. The two will appear at a high school near Mr. Biden's Delaware home to discuss their shared vision for how to defeat President Trump and then lead the country through a pandemic, its economic fallout, and growing racial tensions. The two will then hold an online fundraiser. Russia is brushing off international concerns about the safety of the world's first COVID-19 vaccine. Russian health officials say the criticism is unjustified and that other countries are unhappy about Russia's, quote, competitive advantage. Russia will start mass inoculation this month before clinical testing is completed. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the United States will keep working to deliver democracy to the people of Belarus. Speaking in the Czech capital of Prague today, Secretary Pompeo also said nonviolent protesters in Belarus should be protected and not harmed. Protesters in Belarus have clashed with riot police for 3 straight nights in a battle over Alexander Lukashenko's claim to a landslide victory in Sunday's presidential election. The Kentucky Derby will look a lot different this year, at least in the stands. Churchill Downs says it will limit the attendance to fewer than 23,000 fans, or less than 14% of the attendance record. The temperature checks, medical questionnaires, physical distancing, and face coverings will be required. The Kentucky Derby is scheduled to be held on September 5th. It's usually the first Saturday in May. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. Earlier today, I spoke with House Majority Whip James Clyburn about the nomination of Kamala Harris, the senator from California, to run with Joe Biden. You'll remember that Congressman Clyburn was one of the early supporters of Joe Biden. This is what he had to say about what Senator Harris has to add to the ticket.
She brings to this ticket a smorgasbord of qualifications. She is a sharp debater. We have seen that as she performed as a member of the Judiciary Committee. She is, as I said, experienced in the kinds of backgrounds that we need sensitivity from in our government today. She has won statewide office in California. She has served in the United States Senate. And quite frankly, she has the kind of skill set that I think are necessary in order to win this year. This is going to be a tough campaign. No matter what we may see, what the polls may be saying, this is going to be a very tough campaign. We found out that just being popular, winning the popular vote, won't get it. We did that before. You got to win in strategic places. And I think that she gives to this ticket the ability to win in those strategic places.
Congressman, as you say, it's going to be a tough campaign. We already saw right away out of the White House a response to Senator Harris's nomination. One of the things that they really are picking on is she tends to be a socialist, they would say. She goes to the radical left. She did take a position of eliminating private insurance and health care during the campaign, although she backed off of that some. Is there a vulnerability there that the Trump campaign can exploit, that she is too far left?
Well, you know, I say all the time, the country does not move on a linear plane. This country is always going back and forth like a pendulum on the clock. It goes right for a while, it goes back left for a while. It went left when they elected Barack Obama. It went right when we elected Donald Trump. And from the moment people got an experience with him, they started back to the left. But I always say, going left to right, right to left, it passes through the center. So this country camps out more in the center than it does to the left or the right. And I really believe that this ticket is right where the country is today, moving back to the left, but more a little center right. It may move center left, but this ticket is right where the country is. And I'm very proud of this ticket.
Congressman, one of the things that commends Senator Harris, at least to some people, is her law enforcement experience, both as a district attorney in San Francisco and then as the California State Attorney General. And that might be helpful to a President Trump who's really addressing the law and order and really pushing that button hard. On the other hand, could it somewhat dampen the enthusiasm from the African-American community, particularly from males, because of her prosecutorial history of being very tough on some young African-American males?
Well, I think that being tough is something that we have to really qualify. It's a quantification that needs to be qualified, in my opinion. I think that when you follow the law, remember, she was adamantly against the death penalty. And some people said that means you're too liberal. And she enforced the laws on the books. And some people wouldn't be saying you're too conservative. The fact of the matter is, she was a successful district attorney, a successful attorney general, an effective United States senator, and I think she'd be just as good as vice president of the United States and would make a tremendous chief executive if it were to come to that.
Part of my conversation with House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn. Coming up, we're going to talk with Boston Fed President Eric Rosengren. He says that states rushing to reopen have slowed the U.S. recovery. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're going to go now to our colleague Michael McKee, who is joined by Boston Fed President Eric Rosengren. Michael?
Thank you, David, and thank you, President Rosengren, for joining us on Bloomberg Radio and Television worldwide today. I'd like to start with this morning's data, an unexpectedly large jump in the consumer price index. That started, or at least contributed to a debate on Wall Street about whether all the stimulus that's been pumped into the economy is inflationary. Some people even talking about the possibility of stagflation. Are those bad takes, or is it a reasonable discussion to have?
I think it's very premature to be concerned about a significant increase in inflation. I would say I'm still actually concerned that we're going to have difficulty reaching our 2% inflation target. So remember, inflation is a sustained increase in prices. I think what we're seeing in some of the monthly reports is some things have been a little scarce as a result of the pandemic. Other things are in abundant supply. And we're seeing things like airline tickets and some other areas where it doesn't really reflect robust growth, but actually reflects the cost structure that occurs while we're having a pandemic. So I think there are going to be relative price changes that from time to time increase and make the reported numbers seem larger. But right now with 10% unemployment, I'm not particularly concerned about inflation growing at a rapid rate.
On the growth side, there seems to be a growing feeling that we might see a resurgence of the virus this fall, and that would hit GDP, that would hit growth. You were very strong this morning in saying the U.S. in many places opened up too quickly.
The economy is very closely tied to how the path of the pandemic goes. And so in the talk that I gave, and the charts are available on the Boston Fed website, I looked at Europe versus the United States. Europe ended up taking a big hit because they had very significant shutdowns. But now they're out and about much more than in the United States because they've been able to control the pandemic better than the United States as a whole. I then compared the state patterns. And so what the state patterns show is that those regions of the country, particularly in the South and the West, that opened up very quickly and with somewhat abandon, ended up getting a short-term boost to their economy, but it also increased the infection rate quite significantly. And as the infection rate has increased, people have changed their behavior, and either through changes in state mandates or changes in people's behavior, they're doing less spending, they're less mobile than they were. And so you see in the data that the New England and Mid-Atlantic states are now doing better because they had a more significant shutdown and were more restrained in how they opened up. I think as we get into the fall, that's going to be an important lesson to learn, that we need to follow the data very closely on what's happening with the pandemic. And if there starts to be an increase, we need to take more significant changes either in our behavior or in the state requiring mandates that require that behavior.
Well, at least one of your colleagues has suggested the need for another lockdown. Would you go that far?
I think ideally it's much less costly to wear masks, to socially distance, to not be in big groups in poorly ventilated places. If we follow those guidelines, we can probably do less costly solutions than a shutdown. But if we don't either follow the guidelines by the CDC, and if the behavior doesn't change, in those parts of the country, the pandemic could quite possibly get severe enough that we run out of ICU units, and as a result of the capacity at the hospitals, have to actually shut down. I think there may be some regions of the country that are pretty close to that right now. I do think as the weather turns and it gets colder and schools are back in session, or at least some schools are back in session, the chance of the virus becoming more severe in the fall, I think, is substantial. I know the hospitals in the Boston area are preparing for another wave in the fall. I think that's probably true at most hospitals around the country. So I think this is a time to be quite vigilant. And I would highlight that being too relaxed now may have severe outcomes, both for the health and mortality of citizens, but also to the economy as well. So if you want a strong economy, we need to take actions against the pandemic that prevent the pandemic from shutting down the economy.
Well, given all that, what's your outlook for growth and unemployment through the end of the year, say? Have you changed it?
I've not changed my forecast that much. My own forecast is predicated on us having another wave of infections that were not effective in avoiding person-to-person transmission in a significant way. And I think that's going to result in either people's behavior or state mandates that slow the economy more than I would like to see. It's certainly much less costly than a shutdown, to take appropriate actions now. But it seems like our political leaders are fairly reticent to take those actions. And I think human behavior being what it is, many people have been less willing to wear masks, avoid social gatherings, et cetera.
Speaking of actions that the Fed can take, there's been talk of changing your forward guidance come September, perhaps to a state-dependent kind of guidance that would tie the Fed's interest rates to an outcome like inflation running a little hot for a while. Where do you stand on that?
I think there'll be an appropriate time to have forward guidance. I think at this stage of the recession and the pandemic, that forward guidance probably is only mildly helpful. And the reason for that is the long-term Treasury rate is still quite low, interest rates are quite low. And in that environment, I think people are already assuming it's going to be quite some time before interest rates rise again. So while it might be marginally helpful, I would actually say that our lending facilities and some of the facilities being run by the New York Fed are probably providing more support because they're getting at the cost of funds to individuals and businesses that I think are more important for what the outcome for the economy will be.
I want to talk about lending programs. Chairman Powell emphasizes, of course, that the Fed can lend, not spend. Is that the wrong prescription for the economy right now? Your lending programs have not seen a lot of take-up.
No, but they've been quite effective in many respects. So the announcement of our willingness to buy corporate securities quickly pushed those interest rates down. And as a result, we didn't need to buy very much because the market reacted to our announcement. So I would say credit conditions are much better than they were in March or April because of the Federal Reserve's actions. And I think that has been an important stimulus to the economy. In terms of spending, that has to come from fiscal policy. So the US economy also benefited from the kind of very quick and very significant stimulus provided by both providing better unemployment benefits, broader unemployment benefits, checks to low-income individuals. All those things have been very helpful in preventing particularly low-income individuals from being able to continue to make spending decisions over the course of the spring and into the summer. But I think many of those programs have ended as of the end of July. The pandemic has not ended. The unemployment rate is still above 10%. So we need stimulative fiscal policy to continue. I think that's critically important that Congress come up with some kind of agreement to continue to provide support.
Have you modeled the impact from the end of that fiscal stimulus?
My personal assumption in my forecast is that some form of additional stimulus is going to occur. It would definitely be bad news both for my forecast and for the economy if we don't do any additional stimulus at this time.
Back to the lending programs for a bit. The Fed last night announced it was lowering the fee charged for the municipal lending facility. Is that a sign that perhaps it wasn't properly designed?
No, I think it's a reflection of how much interest rates have moved down. So that program was designed as a penalty rate so that if a borrower was particularly stressed, they would find it attractive. But if they were not particularly stressed, they would not find it attractive. As market rates have moved down, it's quite natural that we move down with it. So I think it's actually a reflection of the success of the program that they're lowering the rate.
You supervise the Main Street program. That's perhaps the most controversial. According to your figures, $856 million in loans in the system, but it's a program that could do $600 billion in loans. Does that suggest modifications need to be made to the Main Street program?
Well, I'd highlight we've already made quite a few modifications. So we had an initial term sheet. We came out with a revised term sheet, and then it was revised once again to make the program broader and more accessible to a wider range of small businesses. We've also opened it up to the nonprofit sector. While we're not live on that part, banks are perfectly able to start the negotiations with the nonprofits. As you know, it takes a long time to actually negotiate a bank loan. So it doesn't surprise me that we would start gradual and that it would pick up over time. And so I think that's exactly what we're seeing. One reason we're seeing a lot of the lending coming primarily from community banks and mid-sized banks is they're probably a little bit more flexible and are able to adapt more quickly. I would expect that larger banks over time will start using the facility more. And the goal is to make sure that businesses that actually need it, that are creditworthy in February, that have had their cash flow disrupted and are likely to be viable businesses after the pandemic is over, are able to get that kind of cash flow financing. And I think we are seeing a pickup in that activity. I expect as borrowers and as banks get more familiar with the program, we'll continue to see increases. However, if we don't see the kind of increases that we would expect given the economic conditions, we've previously revised the term sheet. We could obviously do it again if the economy were to be worse off and the program was not to expand. That would be a time for the Treasury and the Board of Governors to rethink some of the parameters. But at this stage, I think it's premature to say that. I do think that we've been seeing a very significant increase over the last 2 weeks. I think that's going to continue. People hope that these programs happen instantaneously, but you can buy securities instantaneously. You can buy lots of corporate bonds, lots of Treasury securities, a lot of mortgage-backed securities. This program's getting in a part of the market that doesn't move quickly. It requires the borrower and lender to spend a lot of time negotiating. And the fact that the Federal Reserve's involved as well means that there's a separate set of legal agreements tied to the CARES Act, tied to the 13.3 facility. So it's going to take a little while for this to go up, and I think we have to be patient.
I guess the final question I'd ask is, how much of this do you think you'll end up using, in the sense of how bad is the economy going to get this fall that people would be coming to the Main Street facility?
Well, I think you're exactly right. It depends on how the economy progresses. And as I highlighted at the beginning of this interview, that depends on what happens with the pandemic. Unfortunately, since I actually think the pandemic is quite likely to get worse as we get into the fall, that means I am worried that the economy will get worse. That will mean that firms that were hoping not to need to access this program will probably need to access this program as both banks become more constrained and as businesses become more concerned that the disruption in their cash flow occurred much longer than they expected.
Eric Rosengren, thank you very much for joining us today from the Boston Fed. I'll send it back to you. David?
Thank you so much to Michael McKee. He is our chief economics and policy correspondent in that rather far-reaching interview with Eric Rosengren from the Boston Fed, where he said basically it's up to the virus. We've got to decide on what the virus is going to do to get us out of this, that we can social distance. We don't need to shut down the economy. At the same time, he thinks it's critically important that, in fact, Congress does come up with some sort of stimulus package. That's what his projections for the economy are based upon, and that's what he thinks we need. At the same time, he thinks their lending programs are doing rather well despite some hiccups in them getting started. So that was Eric Rosengren speaking with Michael McKee. Coming up in the second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, we're going to have more with Council on Foreign Relations President Richard Haass talking about things like Iran and our alliances. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.